Hello everyone. Welcome to this special episode of Africa Agri Expo that is going to take place this year on the 19th and 20th of February at KICC, Kenya. And my name is Tanya, and today we are diving deep into a fascinating and critical topic that lies at the intersection of legal, economic, and agriculture. We will explore how legal frameworks, economic policies, and trade agreements are shaping Africa's agriculture landscape today. Joining me is a renowned expert in this space, founder and chairman, Mr. Michael Sudarkasa at ABG Group, a leading advisory firm that is focusing on Africa's economic development as well as on the agriculture sector. Michael brings us a wealth of knowledge on investment opportunities, legal structures, and trade policies across the continent. Welcome, Michael, to the show. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Absolutely, same here. So, Michael, let us start by understanding the legal landscape for agriculture in Africa, bringing your expertise in. And from your perspective, how do existing legal frameworks impact the development of the agriculture sector in Africa?
Excellent. I think that one of the things that you have to kind of ground when you're thinking about this is the fact that agriculture in many economies, in fact, most economies in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, is a major pillar of their economy broadly. In some
Right.
countries, it's up to 60% of the population is
Mm.
directly or indirectly involved with agriculture.
Right.
What's happening, and I'll say one of the key areas that is impacting and will impact the continent's growth in this space in terms of how food systems develop is around land tenure.
Mm.
Because in many rural communities,
Right.
land is owned collectively.
Right.
And one of the things that drives investment in land broadly
Mm.
is the right to have ownership of it
Ownership.
for the investor. So
Absolutely.
one core fundamental part, and it's happening across the continent, is improvement, if you will, in land tenure laws.
Mm.
The other area I think that is key and a great driver is the trade frameworks.
Right.
Many countries on the continent are smaller. And
Right.
so if you think about the overall African GDP, roughly $3 trillion, 44%
Mm.
of that is in just five countries.
Right.
So they would be the magnet for the most, I'll say the greater part of the investment on the continent
Right.
without having the trade laws like the African Continental Free Trade Area that has one thing, but I can set up anywhere. And
Right.
then my products, my market is not limited just to my country. So that's going to be a major one. We currently have regional economic communities. So
Mhm.
those structures are also very important. But AFTA is even larger. So you would have all 54 countries on the continent
Right.
ascending to that protocol. I think
Mm.
the other area that one thinks about are regulations, phytosanitary regulations, quality
Okay.
regulations, so that you have, whether it's the inputs that are being utilized by your farmers, the product quality as it
Mm.
moves, that's a critical area. So you have different policies and regulations in these areas that drive and support agriculture, and also the broader investment environment in a country.
Right.
What is government doing to attract foreign investment, but even domestic capital? If you have capital markets, that makes your country more attractive than if you don't. Your fiscal policy. One of the
Mm.
challenges on the continent is that in many instances, Africa's fiscal policy is buffered by global development. So when the
Right.
West determines that it wants to lower inflation by raising the interest rates, there's a sucking sound of capital that was in the emerging markets moving to the West.
Right.
And there's not a lot that African governments can do to stop that. But that means that their currencies depreciate. It means that their imports of inputs and other parts of the economy, whether it's machinery, all cost more. Their debt, when they have debt, is more expensive. So these are all areas um, that touch on the legal ag nexus.
Right. So, Michael, you just mentioned the idea of land ownership, and I feel that that is also somewhere a challenge that the African farmers sometimes face, right? So, I want to understand from you that how these land rights and ownership laws are like differentiated, or how do they vary across different African countries? Is there a prominent differentiation that we can understand on these land ownership rights, and how do they affect the idea of investment in agriculture, and especially when it's coming from outside?
So I think one of the big things that you have, one is the trend. So the trend is moving towards increased land tenure. So
Right.
we're starting from kind of historical. The chief owns the land, the community owns the land. What you do find though is some countries are saying what we'll give you is a lease, a long-term lease.
Yeah.
So the state retains the land as opposed to you, quote unquote, own it outright. But really, what
Right.
an investor as small as a smallholder farmer or a medium-sized farmer is looking
Mm-hmm.
for is certainty that if I make an investment on this land, I
Hmm.
won't be displaced.
Right.
And unless I have that, then when you talk about trying to add buildings to the land, make investments in things like irrigation, it's a incentive if you have the land tenure, and it's a disincentive if you don't. If next
Right.
week you could find out that somebody else is using what you've paid for. So the trend is in that direction. I just mention it because you have countries in the country where we're based in South Africa, land ownership has been a long contentious issue because the land was taken
Absolutely.
during apartheid. And if you have to buy it back, whether it's been enhanced or not, that's an expensive proposition. But it's a starting proposition if you don't have access, particularly to arable land.
Right.
So those are issues. In other African countries, it's more just the modernization of the land tenure laws in that country is a
Hmm.
process that happens.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that answer. I think it was interesting to know that the kind of differentiation that is it is also impacting stakeholders within the African region as well, and that there are certain challenges that the local farmers or the stakeholders of the agriculture sector are facing within Africa. That was important to know. Uh, let's let's now try to shift gear to the economic side.
Yeah.
Michael, Africa's agriculture sector, according to me, holds immense potential for investment, especially both internal and external. So, what are some of the current trends that you are personally witnessing from this potential, and how do you think that this is going to be beneficial for stakeholders in Africa that are involved in agriculture?
I think one of the key evolutions in how we think about African agriculture is the shift towards talking about food systems, the African food system.
Okay.
So in 2030, according to the African Development Bank,
Hmm.
the African agriculture slash food market should be a $1 trillion market.
Okay.
In years past, a lot of the focus had been on the predominant, I'll say, category of African farmer who's a smaller holder farmer,
Hmm.
really a subsistence farmer that produces a little bit more than they need. And so they sell. That's the community that feeds Africa
Right.
in large part in many countries.
Hmm.
As you talk about the food system, and a lot of the focus on the smallholder farmer had been on getting them quality inputs So small farmers in Africa don't really use inorganic fertilizer in comparison to their counterparts in other parts of the world.
Right.
So what does that mean and why is that important? The inorganic fertilizer, again, aligned with the soils in that country and aligned ideally with the product, the crop that's
Right.
being grown, increases your yield.
Hmm.
So for the effort that the farmer puts in, they get a higher yield, higher return on
Right.
farming, and so it becomes more lucrative for them. It's at a very low base in most of Africa. And so the focus has been over the last 10, 15 years, how do we improve that, enhance that?
Yes, absolutely.
What hasn't happened commensurately, and now we're starting to talk about it, is what role does the market play in getting that farmer to adopt, whether it's again better seed, higher grade
Hmm.
fertilizer, methods of farming itself. Well, the
Right.
pull factor is the market.
Hmm.
So having that farmer not just be a farmer and farming for farming's sake, but be part of the food value chain in their
Right.
country and globally. So one of the changes is more thinking about exports, be they continental exports, so within the region, or be they into global
International.
value chains.
Yes.
AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, should be a stimulus for that thinking. So if
Hmm.
I have grains, if I have millie meals, corn, a maize bumper crop in country A, I
Right.
should be able to sell it into country B or C or
Absolutely.
soya. And so those that broader thinking about agriculture, I think, is stimulating growth. The other thing that is going to be an issue, and I say an issue if not addressed, because an issue makes it seem like what's the challenge, is just the rapid growth in population of the African continent. So
I
within the
agree.
next 25 years, the continent will double in size.
Yes.
Um, Roughly now 1.4 billion or so. Um, and it started that growth pattern last 5 to 10 years.
Which
2050
hampers the food security
will be
aspect as
now
well.
at 2 billion. So you've got to increase the output
Yes.
to keep food security. And
Yes.
that's a growing focus as well.
Right.
And lastly, there's one last point that I think is key. Much greater attention is being paid now
Mm-hmm.
to the impact of climate change.
Right.
Because as droughts expand, as floods increase in their severity,
Mm-hmm.
it definitely impacts farmers, particularly smallholder farmers.
Right. So, I think that was an amazing answer. How you drew the like how you try to bridge the gap between the idea of an expected growing output as well as the requirement of the African continent. And I personally feel that the idea of food security is at the brim of potentially important criteria that needs to be addressed by the African continent, because obviously increasing population size and then balancing your food security is something that is a major focus of the government as well. On the flip side, Michael, I would also want you to give a very quick answer as to what are some of the policies or incentives that have been put in place by the African government for the smallholder or large shareholder farmers to attract investments from them in the sector.
Well, I think that for all that has been done, we need to do more. So at all of the fora that are held, central part of that is how do we get more capital to our
Exactly.
smallholders and our small farmers and our SMEs.
Exactly.
Um, One of the areas that an organization that we work closely with, and I mentioned to you, I've had a long-standing relationship with the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership.
Hmm.
They're currently implementing a trade credit guarantee in the fertilizer sector.
Okay.
And one of the things that governments do to create an enabling environment is to say that you can establish this guarantee. And if there's default, you can use our court systems, for example, to recoup what your losses may be. So having a level, strong judiciary in a country brings different kinds of instruments.
Right.
If you can secure your interest in a product that you sell, for
Mm.
example, mechanization product that you sell. So you sell
Right.
a tractor and you lease it though. So the payments are going to be taken over time. That happens more likely in an environment where uh, I know that if there's a default, I can go and reclaim my tractor. It's just not going to disappear and I have no recourse. So one of the things that is helpful, and you see a lot more development in terms of sophistication in the
Right.
farming and the food system sector, where you've got this underpinning of a strong legal system and judiciary and a fair one and a speedy one. Because the
Right.
last thing that you want to do is when you actually do try and make a claim, or if you put in place a contract. So one of the challenges with smallholders, and it's still one where just having the laws is not adequate. You really have to develop an understanding, is
Exactly.
where an input provider gives the farmer the inputs with the agreement that when they sell their produce, when it's harvest time,
Right.
the first person that gets paid becomes
Is
the
the
inputs provider.
yes.
Now, you want to have a contract in place to do that.
Mm.
And there's something called side selling, where the farmer says, well, you were going to pay me 10, and that's what we negotiated. But now the price is 20. So I'm
20.
going to sell to the person for 20 and I'm keeping the money and I don't, you don't get your money back. So that's some of the things that particularly an inputs provider
Mm.
is trying to make sure, well, do I have recourse? And I'm saying that just the legal part is not enough, but that helps you at least say, we did
Exactly.
have an agreement. You
Exactly.
ultimately want to have an understanding with the farmer that says, even if the price jumps a little bit, the fact that I'm continually a partner with you, providing perhaps extension advisory services,
Mm.
um, it's worth it for you to continue our working relationship in this value chain. That's where Africa is going.
Mm.
Uh, and you want to have that framework. In terms of other government initiatives, so governments do provide capital through agencies. So some countries do
Okay.
have agricultural banks, and they
Okay.
put the legislative framework to form capital that, for example, provides lower interest rates for agricultural
Right.
projects.
Right.
Um, Interest rates are very high on the continent in general, anywhere from 15 to 30%. Interest rates for smallholder farmers are even higher. So when government can step in and say you have to give 10% interest rate, that
Right.
the farmer again can get a return on their work. That's a key
Initiative.
regulatory and policy decision that government makes that spurs investment in the sector.
Right. I think that was really interesting to know, and the idea that the government is actually tapping into how they can provide subsidies or how they can incentivize agriculture into the African continent is will eventually lead to the indulging of women and youth as well into the sector. I think I so far in my journey of exploring the African agriculture sector, I have been able to witness that there is much more youth in indulgement into the sector than it was it was there a while ago. So I think all of these incentives plays a very important role. Michael, another thought that comes to mind is that policy harmonization is also another crucial area. And we earlier discussed that within the African region, some countries have different, their own personal laid down regulations for the smallholder farmers or the SMEs or the large holder stakeholders of the agriculture sector. So we often hear that these varying regulations across countries can, bring trade barriers. So my last question to you is that how can governments work together to harmonize policies that make this trade easier for the agricultural products and for the farmers to actually reap the benefits of their produce?
So this idea of, let's say, the policy and the regulatory underpinning of regional integration is something that the African Union has been driving 40 plus years, if you will.
Right.
Um, the regional economic communities are really at the coalface of harmonizing policy and regulation within the five regions of the African Union. So,
Mm-hmm.
within the Southern African Development Community, the Common Market of East and Southern Africa, the East African Community, there's ongoing efforts to make sure that policy in country A is
Right.
harmonized better with policy in country B.
Yes.
We just had last week had up three, the
Mm.
third 10-year strategy for agricultural development in Africa under the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan.
Right.
Through there, you have the identification of blocks, if you will, that impede trade and impede the development of agriculture, and strategies that are intended to actually address those. So it is a area of activity that is front and center within the African Union, the regional economic communities, and then countries, neighboring countries.
Right.
You still have competition at times because if you have from the president's standpoint, the minister of agricultural standpoint, um, a drought in your country, or you
Right.
feel there's a deficit, you may say, even though there's policy for my farmers to trade,
Mm-hmm.
I want to try and retain this food because again, food security is the thing
The
that
goal.
is critical. And you
Yes.
have, again, with climate change um, as a big part of that, whether there's displacement because of that, you're trying to get the country to put the region's good
Right.
ahead of the population. That's always a work in process and in progress. But it's what's evolving, I think, is also the recognition that through AFTA and food trade in the region, the continent as a whole becomes more food secure. So you have the steps being taken um, under the CAADP framework. You have sub agreements. There's an African fertilizer and soil health
Right.
10-year action strategy as well. So you have these different sub structures within the overall food system, but they're all meant to drive increased collaboration, to
Right.
make the markets more seamless, to
Hmm.
take advantage of the economies of scale of one African market if you can get
Absolutely.
there.
Absolutely. Yes. So, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. And I think it's clear that the intersection of law, economy, and agriculture is key to unlocking Africa's agriculture potential, as you mentioned. So, before we wrap up, is there any final advice that you would particularly like to give to the investors or the policymakers or those who are part of the agribusiness leadership and are looking to engage in Africa's agriculture sector through multiple mediums? So, is there any advice that you'd like to give?
I think you mentioned it in passing, and I always like to underscore the power and impact of the continent's growing youthful population.
Right.
Um, by 2030, the population in Africa will be close to 600 million people, most of whom will be young people, and they are moving into the agricultural sector.
Right.
But they one need support. They need funding support. They need extension services, technical support. They're much more inclined to use technology. So be it irrigation, be it mechanization. There's a lot happening in the ICT space,
Right.
and young people work with drones. And so thinking about how to support those young people, to me, is the recipe towards preparing Africa for from a food security standpoint to feed the 2 point plus billion people that will be on the continent
Right.
in the next 25 years. Broadly speaking, as well, the continent has 30% of the world's arable land available. So this, to me, is a very important sector to focus on, not just for domestic food security, but to be major suppliers of food to the world. And so
Right.
that's how one looks to me, I think should look at the sector. There's a growing domestic market if you think about the 2 billion people on the continent. So food is a good investment area,
Right.
including primary production in the agricultural space.
Right. I think that was some really realistic and powerful advice from your end. Thank you, Michael. And please keep following us for more conversations about the agriculture sector in Africa. Stay connected with us on our website. And this is going to be under the banner of our event, Africa Agri Expo, on the 19th and 20th of February 2025. Thank you. And Michael, until next time, thank you for keeping us inspired and understanding the importance of transformation in the African agriculture sector.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.